Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Memoirs of a Professional Cad by George Sanders. Narrated by Liam Gerrard. Book 1. Chapter 1. On July the 3rd, 1906, the world was at peace. Nothing of any consequence seemed to be happening in the capital cities of any of its countries. Nothing disturbed the summer lethargy of its population. Everywhere people dozed contentedly, unaware that an event of major importance was taking place in St. Petersburg, Russia. At number 6 Petrovsky Ostrov, to Margaret and Henry Sanders, a son of dazzling beauty and infinite charm was being born. It was I. I emerged, somewhat reluctantly, from my mother's womb at 6 o'clock in the morning. My father, who had been warned of the impending event only a short time prior to its occurrence, had rushed off to get the midwife who lived across the Neva on the Vasilsky Ostrov. He drove in a droshky to the Tuchkov Bridge, a wooden bascule or drawbridge, which was opened sometimes in the summer to let the river traffic through. It was opening when he reached it. Alighting from the carriage and disregarding the warning cries of the boatman, he leapt across the widening gap and ran the rest of the way to the midwife's house. He brought her back across the river in a rowboat, and in a state of exhaustion pushed her into my mother's room, where she accomplished a successful delivery. In the light of the fact that I have been supporting my father for the past 20 years, his concern for my welfare at the time of my birth would appear to have been thoroughly justified. I was born into a world that was soon to disappear. It was a world of clinking champagne glasses, of colonnaded private ballrooms with scintillating chandeliers, of heel-clicking bemonocled princes in gorgeous uniforms, intent upon their ladies as they drove in their jingling troikas through the moonlit snow. A world that was not to be recreated for 40 years, and then by MGM in CinemaScope with Fernando Lamas. My parents were not members of the nobility, nor were they terribly rich, but, like most people seemed to be in those days, they were well off. They were both born in St. Petersburg, but were not Orthodox Russians, since their ancestors came from Scotland. My mother was descended through her grandmother from the Thomas Clayhills of Dundee, who went to Estonia in 1626 to establish a business there. Thus it was from forebears of solid social position and impeccable respectability that my mother came. To the best of my knowledge, my father came in the mail. We had a summer house in Estonia at a place called Hungerberg. In common with its neighbours, it had a large veranda overlooking the beach. Mixed bathing was not allowed, since everybody swam or paddled in the nude. Men and women went into the water in shifts, controlled by the position of a pennant attached to a tall flagpole that dominated the beach. When the pennant was down, it was the men's turn. When it was raised, the men would come out of the water and disappear into their respective beach-house enclosures. Then, timorously, casting wary looks to right and left, and crossing their arms across their breasts to clothe their nudity, the women would tiptoe out of their cabanas, and, gaining courage with every step, make their way down to the water's edge, where they would dunk themselves like so many doughnuts, squealing with sensual delight, secure in the conviction that they were not being observed. Meanwhile, the men would take up their favourite positions on the verandas, whence they watched these activities through high-powered binoculars. In this manner, a commendable degree of decorum was preserved within an atmosphere of genteel concupiscence, and my own instruction in anatomy, though frequently interrupted by the importunities of my nurse, was initiated on a solid foundation. Many of our winters were spent on an estate we had acquired across the Finnish border at a place called Mustamaki. While in the grounds of our townhouse in St. Petersburg, we had a private skating rink and a couple of artificially built-up toboggan runs. In Mustamaki, the whole countryside, blanketed with crisp, sparkling snow, lay open to us for skiing, skijouring, and riding spuckstotin. There was the incomparable, invigorating air scented by the pine trees. There was the ice yachting on the frozen lake. There were the high-speed sleighs drawn by diminutive, fast-running Finnish ponies, their bridles hung with merrily jingling bells. The estate was to prove a godsend when the time came for my parents to flee from the Bolshevik Revolution. When I look back on my childhood, it seems to me that all of my activities consisted in swimming, canoeing, sailing, skiing, tobogganing, skating, and listening to my father play the balalaika. My father was regarded as the best amateur balalaika player in St. Petersburg. He was, in fact, the co-discoverer of the instrument with the celebrated Andreev. Previously, the balalaika was known only to country folk who used it for accompanying their village choirs. Andreev and my father brought the instrument to St. Petersburg, and together they had a lot of successful soirees in fashionable circles. It was at one of these that my mother met my father for the first time and became fascinated by his balalaika. She was a woman of great beauty, as well as being an heiress to a modest fortune, a fact which struck as responsive a chord in my father as any that he could pluck from his bizarre-looking instrument. It was inevitable that a number of balalaika concerts later they were married. The concerts continued. Andreev and my father became the rage of St. Petersburg. In the course of time, word of their virtuosity reached the imperial family, and they were invited to perform at court. Their debut at the vast castellated palace at Gatchina, that was the summer residence of Tsar Alexander III, was so successful they were given medals and decorations of a size and of an order of magnificence that would have turned Douglas Fairbanks positively green with envy. I myself was being taught the violin, but I could not see myself winning any medals at it, so I chucked it. My interest lay in sport, in fun and in games, and of these I had plenty. If it is true that a man's character develops for the good in proportion to the fun, the degree of happiness and the amount of bountiful love he experiences in childhood, then I must have the most noble and wonderful character in all the world. Personally, I feel that I am the living proof of this contention. However, a surprising number of people think otherwise. At all events, until the day that my mother took me to school in England, my life seemed to be nothing but fun. I remember having an odd feeling on the day we left St. Petersburg that we would never return. As it turned out, we never did. It was this poignant moment of leave-taking that was also my closest brush with history. Sir Winston Churchill touched unwittingly upon this moment of my life when he wrote of certain events that were taking place in 1917. In the middle of April, the Germans took a sombre decision. They turned upon Russia the most grisly of all weapons. They transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. Lenin was going in as I was coming out. At the Finland station in St. Petersburg he was being met by his pals Joe Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, and the rest of the Bolshevik gangsters. I was being seen off by my father, my Uncle Frederick in his scarlet Cossack uniform, my Aunt Margaret, Prince and Princess Serevansky, Count Benkendorf, and my cousin Agnes. Lenin was arriving full of plans for my money. I was leaving for school in England, serenely unaware of his existence. To the rest of our gay and well-to-do gathering, Lenin and his fellow conspirators were just a bunch of rather badly behaved peasants. Lenin's plans were not confined to the appropriation of the trust funds that various affluent uncles and aunts of mine had set up to ensure for me the sort of life that would have suited my indolent nature. They were far more comprehensive. They included everybody else's money as well. They also included the murder of most of my relatives. I must confess that there are times when I wish they had included the murder of them all. However, I think I might have spared the ones that provided for me. Quite frankly, I am sorry about the money. I would have liked to have had it. On March the 15th, 1917, in the drawing-room of his special train which had been immobilized at Gatchina by the revolutionaries, the Tsar received Minister of War Gutchko and right-wing deputy Basil Shulgin. They induced him to sign a document which read in part, "In agreement with the Imperial Duma, we have thought it good to abdicate from the throne of the Russian state and to lay down the supreme power." Unbeknown to my family and myself at the time, in signing this document the Tsar had signed away our inheritances, our holdings, and our gilt-edged future, an action for which I personally have never forgiven him. Anyway, it was not long after this that the revolution got started in earnest. It erupted like an angry boil that had been squeezed too soon, its skin becoming red and inflamed, its poisonous pus spreading over the face of Russia, contaminating all but the well-to-do, who languidly turned a blind lorgnette upon it. Incredible though it may seem, in corrupt, fun-loving St. Petersburg life went on the same as before. In private ballrooms and fashionable restaurants, the effete nobility, immaculately attired in their colourful uniforms, toasted one another in vodka and Crimean champagne, while gypsy orchestras played the mazurka, the polka, and the waltz. Gambling for high stakes in the clubs continued uninterruptedly, unaffected by the shooting that was going on outside. The supply of and the demand on the services of the hard-working prostitutes remained in fine balance. The great Karsavina danced to spellbound audiences at the Mariinsky Theatre. Chaliapin still sang. One of the great heroes of my childhood, my Uncle Jack, contentedly pursued one of his favourite pastimes. From his great carved bed, a 22 caliber pistol in his hangover shaking hand, he would shoot flies that had gathered to eat the jam he had smeared on the ceiling. Liveried footmen stood by with champagne, extra rounds of ammunition, orange marmalade, and strawberry jam. Outside in the streets, men were dying for a cause to which they were passionately attached and did not really understand, a cause which only specious dialectics sought to explain. In the houses of the rich, men were dying in a different way. Destitute had signed their death warrants. They were incapable of believing that anything serious was happening. No one took any notice of the fact that, on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson spoke of the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening in the last few weeks in Russia. American sentiment was solidly on the side of the revolutionaries. The very next day, April 3rd, Kerensky's provisional government was granted credits by the USA amounting to $325 million. For this modest sum, America not only guaranteed the success of the revolution, she also bought herself a lifelong enemy, to defend herself against whom it has cost her untold billions of dollars, and a tax burden as onerous as that of 1776. The Tsar certainly had at his disposal the means with which to subdue the revolutionaries, but he didn't have the heart. In 1917, woolen-heartedness seemed to be the order of the day, for in far-off peaceful Hampshire my mother received a letter from my father in which he said that there were no signs of the threatened revolution, and that it was perfectly safe for her to return and join him in St. Petersburg. This she did, having left my brother and myself in the care of English relatives. Not long after her arrival in St. Petersburg, the situation became untenable. My mother and father had to flee for their lives across the ice to Mustamaki, whence they eventually made their way to England. All of their possessions were left behind, and were never recovered. The Tsar and his family were shot, along with most of our relatives and friends. My Uncle Bob got a job playing the cello in a cinema in Finland, and eventually became a professor of biology in Sweden. My Uncle Jack became a professional house-guest, until his welcome wore thin. Then he became a guest in the wrong sort of houses, until in the end he died of syphilis on the Riviera. My grandfather escaped to Switzerland, where he was able to live in great comfort, while at the same time providing financial support not only to my family, but also to our surviving relatives, whose number was fortunately not great enough to put a strain on his resources. He was able to do this by virtue of having had investments in Wall Street which lasted until the crash in 1929. Not long after this greatest of all our catastrophes, it became my lot to assume his mantle of responsibility and to give rather than to receive. It was no surprise to me to discover that the former set of conditions was infinitely more blessed than the latter. Although we made good our escape from Russia in a physical and economic sense, in a psychological sense no escape was possible. The mechanisms at work within the minds of white Russians which prevented them from accepting the reality of the revolution when it started also prevented them from accepting it as an immutable fait accompli when they became its refugees. Even today, after 41 years of uninterrupted communist rule, the Bolshevik Revolution has not been fully accepted by white Russians. My father has never wavered from his conviction that, in the course of time, Russia will go back to what he calls normal, and that he will get all his property back. He is today, at the age of 90, in active negotiation for the return of our house in St. Petersburg. Among the white Russians in Paris and elsewhere, the habit of living in the past became just as deeply ingrained. Consequently, aptitudes and talents were enfeebled, and opportunities to start a new life tragically neglected. So much time was spent in thinking and talking about the past that there was little time for the present. Consequently, though Russian refugees were glamorous and deeply sympathized with at first, Their inability to adjust to their situation became in the course of time an irksome bore to their friends, and an insoluble problem to themselves. A young Russian refugee I know in California told me how much he missed Paris, and how he longed to go back. "Well, why don't you?" I asked him. "I'm afraid of the Russians," he said. "You mean you think they'll move in and take over Europe?" I asked him. "Good Lord, no," he said. "I'm afraid of the White Russians." It is perhaps interesting to note that even the most gifted, the most virtuous, or those most assiduously addicted to the practice of common sense are all equally at the mercy of the almighty booby-trap of circumstance. It makes little difference whether one is kicked upstairs or down. The adjustment is hard to make. The essential requirement is flexibility and the ability to improvise. Football pool winners and impoverished refugees are often found in the same boat. It is not the degree of ill or good fortune that seems to matter. It is the sudden change that unseats people. Of course, all this has been said before in many different ways and by many different people. Perhaps it has never been said better than by W. Somerset Maugham, when he wrote, "In other arts proficiency can be obtained, but in life little more can be done than to make the best of a bad job. Art is an effect of design. Life is so largely controlled by chance that its conduct can be but a perpetual improvisation." Chapter 2. Due to circumstances well within their control, but not within the scope of their knowledge, my parents sent me to the wrong schools. They did what most, if not all parents do, for the appropriate method of educating any individual can only be determined in retrospect. Environment, atavistic tendencies, and inherited talents create needs which are not always catered to by institutions of learning. These needs may lie dormant in an individual, repressed by fear of failure to conform. Years later they manifest themselves in various ways, but by then it is usually too late. The individual has become a square peg in a round hole, and the burden of responsibility he has acquired in the meantime is too heavy for him to set aside. In my own case, I feel that I am gradually succeeding in re-educating myself to the point I should have arrived at 30 years ago, and if I live long enough, I may be able to catch up with myself. The first school I was sent to was called Bedales. It was a co-educational school, set in beautiful surroundings near Petersfield in Hampshire. The teachers were both male and female, the atmosphere permissive, the food good, the beds comfortable, the discipline lax. One did not learn very much, but boys and girls sat together at desks built for two, and some of the girls were very pretty, and it was rather fun. One day every other week, usually Friday, was called a free day. It was a day on which each student could choose his own curriculum, that is, within reason. They were not allowed to choose pure idleness, as of course most would have wished to do, but they were allowed to work in the workshops, which many of them did, and they were also allowed to choose a girl partner and go for a picnic ramble through the woods. This was the form of activity that I personally favoured, though I used to wonder sometimes if the educational theories we put into practice on these occasions coincided with those of the school authorities. However, my instinct told me that it would be imprudent to inquire. On Saturday nights there was dancing in the great hall, dark corners of which were decorated with mistletoe. The permissive nature of this educational system did not, however, extend to the point of sanctioning some of my brother's activities. On one occasion, when a master was gently reminding him that it was time for classes, my brother saw fit to intimidate him with a loaded revolver, and was promptly expelled. Shortly after this unfortunate incident, my parents decided to remove me from Bedales and send me to the same school that my brother was to attend, Brighton College. It was with infinite sadness that I said farewell to my girl friends, the comfortable beds, the well-cooked meals, the indulgent teachers, the mistletoe, and the beautiful scenery of Hampshire. Now began 4 years of poor food, uncomfortable beds, sordid scenery, irascible, acidulated teachers, frequent beatings, no girls, no fun, nothing but pimply-faced boys of all shapes and sizes. A rough-and-tumble bunch they were, the flotsam and jetsam of lower-middle-class families, congregated in the cloistered, austere, and somewhat moth-eaten atmosphere of a second-rate public school, of which they were incongruously proud. Proud of an institution dedicated to prepare them to be square pegs in round holes, an institution which sponsored the diurnal practice of informing the boys from the pulpit of the school chapel that they were sinners, and the nocturnal practice of beating them with canes to bring about a measure of their redemption, an institution whose main purpose seemed to be that of convincing the boys that they were dunces. I myself was a poor student, partly because it was the fashion, and partly because the efforts of the teachers to convince me that I was a dunce were highly successful, as were also their efforts to convince me that I was a sinner. When I finally left the school after 4 years of manufacturing cigarettes out of blotting paper, which we smoked at the back of the classroom, playing practical jokes on masters and boys alike, and generally excelling at totally unnecessary activities such as football and cricket, I left with a sense of utter worthlessness and the conviction that I was too stupid to cope with life. Looking back across the 35 years that have elapsed since that memorable day, I must confess that little has happened in my life to make me feel justified in altering that opinion. Sometimes, when my spirits are depressed, I get the strong feeling that when I meet my teachers in the next world, I shall be able to tell them that, after all, they were right. Chapter 3. The first job I got after I left school was in a textile producing company in the grimy city of Manchester. It was a job for which, even if I had been able to get the hang of my duties, I could not have demonstrated any aptitude, nor engendered any genuine interest. I can only assume that my motive in getting it in the first place sprang from an adolescent desire to prove to my parents, whom I had persuaded to let me leave school, that I was capable of supporting myself. I proved the reverse. My salary was only £2 a week, on which of course I could not live, and which therefore had to be supplemented by an allowance from home. It was a relief to everyone, including myself, when, after a year of this fruitless activity, I was good-naturedly thrown out of the company. My next job, which I got through the lack of influence of my father, was with a cigarette manufacturing company in Argentina. I worked for a while in the factory in Buenos Aires, and after that I was sent into the provinces, and eventually to Patagonia to compile a survey. The company wanted to know what the people of Patagonia were smoking, and whether they could be induced to smoke the company's brand. I had little heart for the latter part of my mission, since I felt that whatever they were smoking would be an improvement on what I had to sell them. From Buenos Aires I travelled to Ingeniero Yacobachi, where the railroad came to an end, and one had his choice of proceeding south on foot, on horseback, or in a Model T Ford, following barely discernible wagon tracks. Choosing the Model T, I bribed an Indian guide who spoke Guarani, the native language, to accompany me into the wilds. And wilds they were. There were virtually no roads, no electricity, and no hotels. The custom in that part of the world at that time was that travellers would be bedded and fed free of charge at privately owned sheep ranches, which, though few and far between, were the only means of shelter available. However, hospitality was only extended if one arrived before sundown. Because of the numerous hard-working bandits in this area, the ranchers had a discouraging habit of opening fire with Winchester rifles on anyone approaching their property after dark. But the traveller arriving before the sun had set, and because he was a potential bringer of news and gossip to a community which had no other means of obtaining it, was welcomed with open arms and inexhaustible hospitality. He could stay as long as he wanted to, and never be expected to pay a farthing. It occurred to me at the time that, by choosing his route carefully, a man could make a career of visiting sheep ranches in Patagonia. In fact, I was tempted to abandon my survey and embark upon such a venture myself, but finally, and somewhat reluctantly, decided against it. Naturally enough, we tried to reach one of those ranches each day before sundown, but on many occasions this was not possible, and we would have the tantalizing experience of getting within sight of a ranch just as it grew dark. On these occasions we would camp where we were, first digging a circular trench and filling it with the dried dung of the guanaco, a llama-like animal which abounds in Patagonia, and then lighting the dung, which would smoulder all night, serving the dual purpose of keeping us warm and frightening off the wild animals. The guanaco, incidentally, is a paradoxical beast. Although it has many of the temperamental deficiencies of the camel, such as a proclivity for spitting and biting, it can be domesticated, and then becomes docile enough to answer to its name. Because these creatures destroy the ranchers' crops, the government had put a $2 bounty on each guanaco head brought in. I often wondered why, in the view of the ease with which the animals could be tamed, someone had not set himself up with a guanaco ranch, corralling and domesticating a few hundred of the creatures, and then lopping off a dozen or so heads for the bounty whenever he had need of spending money. After 3 months in the wilds, I began making my way from ranch to ranch back to civilization. Patagonia has a stark, moon-like topography. It is dusty and lonely, and there is a constant irritating wind that whistles right through you. Buenos Aires was to me, on my return, an entirely new world. After my primitive existence in Patagonia, I was in perfect health, and savoured everything I saw and experienced. I remember standing on a corner of the Plaza de Mayo, my mouth hanging open like some country bumpkin, staring at the myriad bright lights of the city, the sleek, powerful cars, the elegantly dressed women. For 2 full weeks this wonderful feeling, almost like being born again, invested all of my activities. I was sharply aware of the worried faces of the men who hurried by me on the street, carrying the inevitable briefcases. They, on the other hand, seemed to notice nothing around them. After months of nearly total abstinence, 1 martini would make me quite light-headed. So it was that from this experience I arrived at the conclusion that, to enjoy one's life to its fullest, one must build contrast into it, and the more extreme the contrast, the fuller the life. I had thoroughly enjoyed my travels through the wilds of Patagonia, where at times I felt almost like an animal. My senses became more acute, and I virtually glowed with good health. I lived and ate simply and slept soundly. The robust state of health I was in, and the kind of life I was leading, would produce in me an appetite so ravenous that I would drool at the mouth like a wild beast at the mere smell of food. It was the custom around sundown for a couple of ranch hands to go out among the sheep and pick out a succulent-looking lamb. They would isolate the animal from the rest of the herd, and then, quickly, with a skill born of years of practice, plunge a knife into a vital part so that it would die immediately, with neither the herd nor itself having sensed danger, and thereby spoiling the meat by a surge of adrenaline, as happens in slaughterhouses. The lamb would be brought back, skinned and prepared for the spit, and would be roasting only a few minutes later. We would sit in a circle around the turning spit, while a gourd of yerba mate, from which we would all drink in turn through a bombilla, was passed around. Finally, the roast done, the ranch owner would turn to the guest and offer him the honour of the first cut. I would draw my knife and cut myself the choicest piece, and then return to the circle, where I would eat it with my fingers, as was the custom. The combination of my ravenous appetite and this tender, pure meat, eaten in the open air, produced a gastronomical sensation which no restaurant in the world could ever hope to provide. On the other hand, when I returned to Buenos Aires, I enjoyed the city just as much. It became a new experience for me. I found, though, that this heightened appreciation of civilized life eventually wore thin, and only a normal interest remained. In order to enjoy life to its fullest, one should not have too much of either the primitive or the civilized life. We all need periods of living as nearly like an animal as possible, even living in discomfort, if necessary. I am a man who loves his comfort devoutly, but I realize that to appreciate comfort to the full, I must have periods without it. Whenever I make a motion picture on location, this need is thoroughly satisfied. Most people can attain this contrast in living during their annual holidays, though few take advantage of the opportunity. They will not find it where they usually seek it, in a holiday spent at a seaside resort or in a populous area. One should live for a time as close to the soil as possible, with virtually no intellectual activity. Books, radios, and all creature comforts should be left at home. Merely changing the scenery doesn't make for much of a holiday, especially if one continues to do the same things. I remember once boarding a steamer in San Pedro, California, for the trip to Catalina Island, and watching 4 men, complete with fat cigars, come onto the boat, go into the lounge, and sit down to a game of gin rummy, which continued throughout the trip, and, I assume, throughout their 2-week vacation. This pursuit of the same activities in changing surroundings is usually a tedious undertaking, and one that is recommended only by the travel agencies. One's life, it seems to me, is mainly enriched by engaging it within its surroundings, and not by the distinctly trying activity of packing and unpacking across the world, plodding through those seemingly inexhaustible cathedrals. A person taking a vacation during which he lives simply, rigorously, and with a complete change of habits, will find on his return to city life that he enjoys the office, the smog, and the routine, and even the conversation of fellow workers he has known for years, if not exactly replete with captivating humour and wit, will at least seem quite interesting. It seems to me that the mistake so many of us make is that of looking for fun during a holiday when the real trick is to use a vacation to make the rest of the year fun. I remained with my Argentine tobacco company for the record period of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?